Andrei, you were born in Russia, but you write in French. You submitted your early novels before you were published under various titles and under different names. And you also have a pseudonym, this Gabriel Osman. Could you talk a little bit about why different titles, why different names, and why the pseudonym after you were published?
D'abord, votre premier roman, votre premier livre, le manuscrit, est-ce qu'il a été accepté tout de suite?
First of all, was your first novel, your first manuscript, was it accepted right away?
I had some rejections.
Moi, j'ai été rejeté 200 fois, peut-être. 200 fois.
I was rejected 200 times.
Oh my God.
Et à un moment, dans mon appartement, il y avait tant de manuscrits que je pensais tout simplement dormir sur ces manuscrits.
At one point in my apartment, there were so many manuscripts that I thought I would just start sleeping on them.
Et je cherchais le moyen d'être publié et j'ai compris mon erreur. Je venais voir les éditeurs et je leur disais, je suis russe, on dit Russian-born, mais j'écris en français. Les éditeurs entendaient mon accent et disaient, s'il parle avec un accent, il écrit avec un accent.
So eventually I understood the mistake I was making. I would go to see publishers and I would tell them, I'm Russian, but I write in French. And they would hear my accent and they would think to themselves, if he speaks with an accent, then he must write with an accent.
Ce qui n'était pas vrai, Et dans ce cas-là, j'ai inventé un traducteur et j'ai présenté mes livres comme traduits du russe.
Which wasn't the case. I didn't write with an accent, but I came up with the idea of making up a translator. So I presented my books as having been translated from the Russian.
Le manuscrit a été tout de suite accepté, le livre a été publié, et il y a eu dans le journal Le Monde, le grand journal, un grand article où le critique disait « Mais quelle merveilleuse traduction !»
The manuscript was immediately accepted, the book was published as having been translated, and there was an article in Le Monde, the great French newspaper, in which the critic wrote, "What an incredible translation."
So I must ask, are you Elena Ferrante?
Pour l'instant, je n'ai pas changé de sexe. Pour l'instant, non. Oui, je suis très, très classique. Oui, je suis très archaïque.
For the time being, I haven't changed gender. So for now, the answer to your question is no. I remain very classical and perhaps even archaic.
Maybe we would like to read a section from the novel now, and then I have some questions on that.
So I'm going to read a brief passage from Brief Loves That Live Forever. Captives in Eden. For several miles, the splendor surrounding us has not varied. A foaming blossom along the boughs, the whipped cream of petals, a white wave spilling the length of an avenue of apple trees where we walk, intoxicated by their scent, which has gradually replaced the air. As if, finding ourselves on an unknown planet, we had grown used to breathing an atmosphere made up of supernatural perfumes instead of the customary combination of terrestrial gases. After a while, our heads begin to spin. It feels as if we are slowly floating along this aromatic corridor that stretches out before us to infinity. I have never in my life seen such an immense orchard, 10 miles by 14, the young woman I am escorting has informed me. It is already an hour and a half since we entered this realm of blossom, so that if we keep straight on along the central avenue, it will take us another 2 or 3 hours to walk the length of this gigantic apple orchard. But more than its extravagant dimensions, what dazzles me is its beauty. Under a powerful sun, this frothy tide washes over us, dazes us with its fragrances, sets us reeling in the dream every man cherishes, that of finding himself walking upon the clouds' curvaceous vapors. There is perfect silence, not one insect, no birds, an unchanging light, the sky deep blue, the immaculate purity of the flower heads, a sweetness hangs in the air. It is paradise. And yet, we are here to demonstrate that all this is a hell. Such is the task undertaken by my friend, a journalist and a passionate dissident, determined to denounce this model orchard in a Samizdat article as one of the absurd creations of Soviet socialism in decline. Look, the whole madness of the communist system is concentrated here. A monstrous orchard with a purely ideological purpose, to create the biggest plantation in the world, a triumph of collectivist agriculture. And that's not all. Whenever the old crocodiles in the Kremlin drive past from Moscow to Kiev, what they see from their limousines is a continuous spread of white, because the trees, as you can observe, are planted close together. It's very pretty. Pretty? Grow up, for goodness sake. You've got a mental age of 10, and you've had it ever since you were at the orphanage. Pretty. What you need to know, my poor friend, is that this orchard is completely unproductive. No bee wants to bust its guts flying 5 miles to reach the center of this crazy plantation. As a result, the flowers are not pollinated, and the trees don't bear fruit. No apples will ever grow in this ideal apple orchard. It's sterile, just like the regime we have the misfortune to live under. Now do you get it? I have concurred, with my head hunched between my shoulders, like a slightly stupid but eager and willing pupil. My friend has now concluded her exposition. Well, it may be pretty, but it's a beauty that's perfectly useless.
That's a really lovely part of the book, and the section that you read, which describes this absolutely lush orchard that Kira points out is beautiful but absolutely useless. I found that concept to be very interesting. It's actually really fascinating, this idea of a useless beauty. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Oui, la beauté est inutile, ou je dirais plutôt la beauté est gratuite. Le terme ne m'appartient pas, c'est plutôt Kant et Hegel déjà dans la philosophie allemande qui parlaient de cela. La véritable beauté ne doit pas servir la politique, l'idéologie, la sociologie, la psychologie, etc. C'est la beauté à l'état pur.
So, yes, beauty is useless, or rather I would say that beauty is gratuitous. The concept does not belong to me. It comes from Kant and Hegel, who wrote in their philosophy that beauty must not be useful, i.e. it must not be used by politics, it must not be used by ideology, it must not be used by psychology, etc., etc. It must not be used.
Mais le problème, c'est que les idéologues, les politiques essaient de faire de la beauté un moyen. Oui, un moyen, un instrument. À Addis Abeba, que vous connaissez, il y a une grande statue de Lénine, la plus grande statue du monde. Et ce n'est pas laid, c'est assez beau, mais il y a derrière une idée purement idéologique.
The problem is that ideologists, politicians, want to make beauty into a means, an instrument. So, for instance, in Addis Ababa, which you know very well, there's a statue of Lenin, which is the biggest statue in the world. It's not particularly ugly, it's actually quite beautiful, but there's an ideology behind it.
This reminds me, actually, now you're saying this, the building of the Moscow Underground. When it's absolutely astounding. It's quite beautiful, and Stalin created this underground. I'm sure, as you know, the beauty of it was meant to be a statement against capitalism. The builders of this underground came to New York to look at the way capitalists built their metro stations. And I thought it was quite funny reading the reports that they saw the way that we were forced to exist in these subways and said, never. This is a curse of capitalism. People are overcrowded, they have to pay too much money, there are rats, and it stinks. So Stalin decided to do something completely different. And it's interesting that this beauty became, it was an ideological concept, that communism could offer this beauty to people in a way that maybe capitalism couldn't.
Oui, quand l'architecte du métro soviétique a demandé à Staline comment faire, quel style, quel genre, quelle forme donner au métro de Moscou, Staline a dit il faut construire des palais. Palazzo.
Yes, when the architect who built the the Moscow subway asked Stalin what style this subway should be in, what form it should have, Stalin said it must be made of palaces, palazzo in Italian.
Mais maintenant je vous pose une question en tant qu'écrivain. Un écrivain à un autre écrivain. Est-ce qu'il y a une possibilité de casser cette logique, de retourner cette logique? Le métro est magnifique à Moscou, mais le message idéologique est là. Est-ce qu'il y a une voie de salut? Est-ce qu'un poète ou un écrivain peut faire quelque chose contre cet emprisonnement, ce servage, cet esclavage idéologique?
But now let me ask you this. I want to ask you a question as one writer to another. Is it possible to break this logic? Is it possible to switch it around, to get away from it? The metro in Moscow is magnificent, but there's an ideology behind it. Is there a way of salvation? Is there a way that a writer or a poet can break this imprisonment, this enslavement to ideology?
Alors,
What?
la solution.
So, give us the solution.
This was actually a question that would have come up. I do believe that is possible, but what I would also like to say is I spoke a little bit earlier about the way that these books are in conversation with each other, and I think Burhan, your book, which is about cities and these the constructions that people build in order to compensate for their ambitions or their search for beauty, is very much an answer to what you are asking. So I'm going to let Burhan, sorry to put you on the spot, but he'll answer later. But I think that is a question that your book raises, and it's also, it's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, because as your narrator is speaking to Kira, I believe that's her name in the chapter, he begins to consider the place of the dissident in the Soviet Union, in a system that's collapsing. And he makes a comment about how people like her who have something to protest and who do protest have become part of an elite caste. And that protest is a luxury that the working class cannot necessarily afford. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. It's a interesting concept that to be a dissident isn't, you have to be able to, it's a luxury. You have to be able to afford to do that.
Oui, mais il faut bien distinguer les dissidents qui ont payé leur engagement par leur vie. Prenez l'exemple de Shalamov ou Solzhenitsyn. Prenez l'exemple de Burhan, n'est-ce pas, qui a payé, qui a couru 1000 dangers en s'engageant sur la voie politique où il s'est engagé. Et puis, il y a une autre sorte de dissidents qui sont un tout petit peu opposants, un tout petit peu contestataires, mais qui jouent avec le gouvernement un jeu qui arrange tout le monde. Vous voyez, ce sont des dissidents qui ne s'engagent pas vraiment, qui jouent un jeu. Oui, ils ont un peu peur du gouvernement, le gouvernement a un peu peur d'eux, mais tout le monde se supporte, tout le monde s'arrange.
Well, we need to distinguish between two kinds of dissidents. There are dissidents who have paid for their commitment with their lives. Look at Shalamov, look at Solzhenitsyn, or look at Burhan, who has been through 1,000 dangers for the political path that he chose to follow. But then we have other dissidents who are a little bit in opposition, who are a little bit dissidents, but really they're playing a game with the government, a game which works out to everybody's advantage. The dissidents, are a little bit scared of the government is a little bit scared of them, but actually they all get along.
Very interesting. One of your narrator in Brief Loves and Oleg in A Woman Loved both belong to a generation that feels very displaced in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they seem trapped by their ideals and their ambitions, as well as by this crumbling structure. In Brief Loves ends with a really, really beautiful section about Dmitry Rys, who rejoices that the regime is collapsing, but then he quickly realizes that in history there is no victor. And I wondered if you could talk about this comment that Dmitry makes, that in history there is no victor, no matter what system is in place.
Voilà, je vous ai posé tout à l'heure la question pour essayer de trouver une solution au métro, au problème du métro stalinien. On se disait, mais comment, finalement, cette beauté, comment peut-on dire, désensorceler, difficile à traduire en anglais, oui, comment défaire cette emprise idéologique. Dmitry Rys, dont vous parlez, qui a compris véritablement comment le faire, qu'est-ce qu'il aurait fait? Il serait venu dans ce métro, il se serait arrêté, et il aurait fait comme Proust, il se serait dit, oui, mais il y a 30 ans, dans ce métro, à côté de cette belle statue, j'ai rencontré la femme de ma vie. On s'est complètement perdu, mais ce souvenir persiste. Et donc, c'est sa mémoire personnelle qui aurait complètement sauvé cet instant. Donc, il aurait supprimé, non pas le message idéologique, mais le temps tout entier. Il aurait vécu un instant d'éternité.
A moment ago, I asked you the question about how to find a solution to the Stalin metro and how to, this is a hard word to translate into English, it's really hard, to demystify the ideological power of it. And Dmitry, the character that you bring up, understood. He knew what to do. He would have come into the metro and he would have done something exactly like Proust would have done. He would have thought to himself, he would have stopped and thought to himself, 30 years ago, next to this statue, I met the woman of my life. And we totally lost touch with each other, but that was such an important moment. And so what he's doing by having that memory is he's, rather than suppressing ideology, he's suppressing time itself, and he's experiencing a moment of eternity.
Through love. Through his memories of love. Is that? You're not sure?
Oui, Proust aurait dit oui.
Proust would have said yes.
Thank you. And throughout the book, it's the title, I thought, at least the English title of this, is really brief loves, the brief loves that live forever. You see the love through each section. That we have a narrator that is quite young in the very beginning and is living in the Soviet Union, and for a moment is caught up by the ideology of it, and believes, I guess, in the propaganda of this. But it's his encounters with either women that he loves, or people who love other women, and their explanations to him of what love means to them, that slowly begins to shake his belief in the political ideology that he had based his whole life on. It's an absolutely beautiful book, and I think that you're wise to mention Proust and mention that that's the way that he would have looked at it as well. Dmitri struck me as a character very reminiscent of Proust. You said in an interview a very, very interesting comment. You've said this in a few interviews. When people ask you why you left Russia, you say, I didn't leave Russia, Russia left me. And I wondered if you could talk about that, explain that comment.
Oui, c'est assez simple et assez difficile à la fois, assez simple et assez difficile à expliquer. En ce sens que quand on a vécu 30 ans en Russie, on est déjà quelqu'un de déterminé par cet idéal dans lequel nous vivions et déterminé par l'effondrement de cet idéal. Donc il y a les deux parties. La Russie s'est réformée très vite et il a tourné le dos à son passé, avec une violence rare, en disant, écoutez, tout ce qui a été dit est faux sur le communisme, la fraternité entre les peuples et entre nos frères humains, tout ça c'est complètement faux. Il faut construire une autre société. Mais j'étais peut-être trop vieux pour m'engager dans un autre projet qui me paraissait un peu, comment vous dire, un peu triste, construire une nouvelle société capitaliste. Mais l'Amérique l'a déjà fait, l'Occident l'a déjà fait. Pourquoi vivre dans une copie? Moi, je préfère vivre dans l'original et non pas dans l'imitation.
The answer is both simple and a little bit difficult to explain. When you've lived 30 years in Russia the way I did, you're already a determined person. You're determined by an ideal that you have lived in, and you're determined by that ideal's collapse, and the collapse of it into two parts. So what happened when the system collapsed in Russia is that it reformed very, very fast, and it turned its back on its entire past with tremendous violence. It was said that everything that was said in the past was false. All the idea of brotherhood, whether it was brotherhood between populations or brotherhood between people, all of that was all wrong, and that now we needed to turn to start something new, a new project. But I think that perhaps I was too old to commit to another project that, how can I say it? I found it a little bit sad, because the idea was to start a new society that was based on something that had already been done. Capitalism had been done in the United States, in the West, and I didn't want to live in a copy of something. I wanted to live in the original version.
Very good. Yeah, I think that I've noticed in Brief Loves, and I've also noticed in your other book, A Woman Loved, how again and again your characters are trying to negotiate with how much of the past to bring with them into the present. And even Oleg in A Woman Loved, as he's making a young filmmaker in this other book who is making a documentary about Catherine the Great, has to constantly renegotiate or negotiate with the history that he knows is correct versus the state-approved history of Catherine the Great, and wanting to find this middle path that might allow him to tell the closest approximation to the truth that he can. And it's very, I see, and again, this preoccupation with being stuck in two worlds comes out very clearly also with your narrator in Brief Loves. Yes, and we have to wrap this up, but I think we've ended on actually a very good note, because we're going to be talking next with Dalia, who is also in her own way negotiating between two worlds in her wonderful book that we'll talk about next. So Andrei, thank you very, very much.
When the world became white. When the world became white, the streets filled with people, and there were sidewalks, and the roads were paved with asphalt instead of ash and sand. And we saw cars and hardly any animals. And pale women strolled past in shorts, and men ate standing up, and discarded plastic bags drifted by instead of sand. And the air was permeated by the stench of gasoline instead of the buzzing of flies. And our home was in midair, and our neighborhood was more than a single building. And they came with signs and drove away the vendors and packed up the market and put up a wire fence and brought concrete blocks and glass and polished it with marble and packed up the heat and shoved it inside, along with the food, in cool, refrigerated air. And slowly the rains went away, and there were mountains of food and oceans of parked cars, and they called it a supermarket. And my sister worked there as a cashier on the night shift in the industrial zone. And I sat and waited for her at the stop bus in my sunglasses, but we didn't see each other. And it was already late by the time I decided to take the bus home alone. When the world became white and not black, because there was light even at night and no need for stars, and you had to pack a bag, present a visa at the border, and drive to Sinai in an old car, and you showered at night with a bottle of mineral water, slept in a hut on a threadbare mattress, and looked up at the stars, and only then you would understand what Mother meant when she said that the stars brightened the night. And then suddenly there were terrorist attacks, and they ordered everyone to evacuate as fast as possible. And my sister could not go there anymore, and she had to rely on what I told her. And I told her there would never be peace. And my mother said this was not okay. And so I went with her on a tour bus to the Dead Sea, and we waded in, and my sister stood in the water and didn't move. And she asked me to come closer because she needed to whisper a secret to me, to tell me that she felt burning pain down there under the surface of the sea.
Thank you very much. Those beautiful, powerful words come from Dalia Sherman's When the World Became White, which will be published in the US in English in 2018. So please look out for it. You can find some of her excerpts of this online, but look out for the short story collection. Dalia Betolin-Sherman was born in 1979 in Ethiopia. At the age of 5, she traveled by foot through Sudan and immigrated to Israel with her parents and sister. Dalia has a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's degree in Hebrew literature. Her debut collection of short stories, When the World Became White, was published in Israel in 2013. She is the winner of the Minister of Culture Award for Debut Writers, as well as the Ramat Gan Debut Fiction Award. So I'm very pleased to have Dalia here. I was in contact with you maybe a year and a half ago, when I discovered her stories, and I was completely blown away by the fact that here was another female Ethiopian writer writing, because it's very, very rare. It's sometimes an uphill battle to even convince your parents that you don't want to be a doctor or you don't want to be an engineer, that you want to be a writer. And that just doesn't make sense until they actually see the book. So she is, to me, like a sister. We are kindred spirits. We fought some of the same battles, not all of them. So I'm very happy to see you here. What struck me immediately when I read your stories, and especially the first story and this section that was read, was the energy behind this. I think there's a momentum behind these words, and as I kept reading it again and again, I said, this energy feels like anger. It feels like an urgency here. And we have this young narrator. These stories are told all from a female perspective. And it begins with a narrator who is quite young and trying to make sense of the world that she now lives in, and then progresses through the years. And in the beginning with this first story, we have a narrator who has no way to describe what she is experiencing except through color. The world is white. Maybe I'll pause so you understand. Yeah, I speak slowly. And she has no language to understand this different world, and except through what she notices immediately. It's bright. There's a supermarket. There's a bus with air conditioning. One of the scenes in the beginning that I found very powerful was this moment with this narrator and her sister. And her sister is called a derogatory word for black. And her sister has a poignant, a powerful reaction to this, where she says, I am not black, I am brown. Any immigrant who has come here to America, I think, will understand exactly what that moment means, to be suddenly given the name of a shade that you had no concept you fit into. So it resonated with me, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that scene.
אני קודם כל אקדים ואגיד שהספר קובץ של סיפורים קצרים כמו שאמרת, והוא מספר על משפחות ממוצא אתיופי שעלו לישראל, ובעצם באתיופיה הם חיו כמיעוט דתי, וכשהם הגיעו לישראל הגיע העניין של הצבע.
First, I'll say as a preface that this is a collection of short stories about Ethiopian families that came to Israel. In Ethiopia, they lived as a religious minority, and only when they came to Israel, this question of color, the issue of color arose.
עכשיו, החיים בישראל הם מאוד שונים מהחיים באתיופיה. אני מתייחסת לעניין הזה שאמרת שקרו הרבה, שבספר יש אנרגיה של דברים שמתרחשים במהירות. קרו המון שינויים, ואחד מהשינויים זה באמת ההתייחסות הזאת לעניין של הצבע.
In Israel, the life is indeed different than it was in Ethiopia. I'm talking about the energy that you mentioned here. And when we came to Israel, one of the changes, one of the differences was really this issue of color.
עכשיו, האנשים שהגיעו לישראל, היה להם חלום להגיע לישראל. כלומר, לא הכריחו אותם להגיע למדינה. אלא הם רצו בעניין דתי להגיע לארץ ולהיות חלק מהעם בישראל, והעניין הזה של הצבע זה היה הפתעה כמו...
The people that came to Israel, they wanted to go to Israel. They were not forced to go to Israel. They wanted to go to that country. It was their dream to live in Israel. And when they arrived in Israel, this issue of color was a complete surprise to them.
עכשיו, העניין הזה של השחור וחום זה בעצם אולי איזושהי בקשה של הילדה שיבחינו בה. כלומר, שיראו אותה כבן אדם פרטי ולא מישהו כללי.
Now the question of this girl. Oh, okay. Now, this girl's request is this question of black or brown. This is the plea of the girl to be distinguished as a person, and she should be seen as brown rather than black.
שיראו אותה כמישהי פרטית ולא כמשהו כללי. כלומר, רק אנשים שקוראים, שלא רק בעניין של הצבע, אלא אולי שתנסה להבחין אם יש לה משהו שהוא מיוחד או שונה, ולא שהיא חלק מאיזשהו קץ.
It's not only a question of color. She wants to be seen as a person, as a human being, as somebody with special characteristics, with special features, not just to be a part of something black or a part of a race.
Good. And I think one of the things that we were talking about in the back was in Amharic, in Ethiopia, there are many different names for the different shades of brown that we are. So it would be a shock to this character, to this young girl, to be suddenly labeled as just black, when there are many words for the variety of shades that exist in the country.
כן, ולאו דווקא בהתייחסות שלילית, אלא באמת כדי להבחין בין האנשים. יש שחור, יש חום, יש כל מיני גוונים באמצע.
Yes, and it's not necessarily regarding the description of the color. It's in order to distinguish between people. There is black, there is brown, and there is many different shades and hues in between.
Thank you. These stories, as I mentioned, are told from a female perspective, a young girl, several girls in each of these stories. And the voice, when the book first opens up, is young. We see only what this narrator sees, and it gives us a limited view of her world. But as the book progresses, and as the characters in each of these stories get a little bit older, we see more of the lives of this Ethiopian-Israeli community. And what struck me was that I think we are so used to hearing stories of migration and stories of immigrants told in these broad sweeps that, a story about migration is a story about crossing borders. It's a story about seeking shelter. It's a story about trying to find where to sleep next, where to get food next. But Dalia's stories are particularly powerful because she has narrowed her focus to families, to domestic issues, to what happens within a community, within the families. We hear the news reports of migrants, of people crossing. We call them migrants, we call them refugees. But what I think we fail to fully understand, and what this book does so beautifully, we never think about the family quarrels that are happening along the way. We never quite think about the fact that a husband and wife that maybe didn't get along before they were forced to leave still don't get along when they're on the road or when they're forced into a refugee camp. That these things don't end. You're still a human being no matter where. And someone who irritated you in Damascus is going to irritate you in Calais. You know, it's just, but now you have to fight over a tent. And I found this, the aspect of this book absolutely riveting. And I wondered, Dalia, if you could talk about your decision to focus on the domestic issues of this community, to talk about what happens within the families, because you could have been broader, but you stayed very, very focused inside the home.
בחרתי להתייחס לפרטים הקטנים, לכל הדברים שקורים בתוך הבית, כדי שאנשים יכירו יותר את האנשים מהקהילה שלנו.
I chose to concentrate more on the small details, on the details of house life in order so that people would get to know our community better.
אנשים שהם, אני אספר ככה, האנשים שלנו, אני, המשפחה שלי והרבה אנשים שהגיעו מאתיופיה לישראל, עברו הרבה שינויים.
I'll put it this way. Myself, my family, many people who came from Ethiopia with us, they went through many changes.
ככה, לפני שלא הגענו באופן ישיר לישראל, אלא עשינו דרך ארוכה מאתיופיה לסודאן, חלק מהדרך ברגל. בדרך קרו הרבה מקרים קשים של מוות, גנבות, אונס. אנשים נשארו גם תקופה ארוכה בסודאן, במחנות פליטים.
Many things, we didn't come directly from Ethiopia to Israel. We went through Sudan. It was a long road, a long trip, some of it on foot. Many unpleasant events happened on the way. People died. There were cases of theft. There were cases of rape.
זה מה שקרה שם, וכשהגיעו לישראל, אז ישראל הייתה שונה לגמרי מאתיופיה, כי באתיופיה אנשים גרו בכפר, עסקו בחקלאות או במקצועות אחרים, הכל סבב היה סביב הכפר, פחות או יותר ניהלו את עצמם, בלי קשר כל כך עם הממשלה, בלי תמיכה או עזרה.
And when they came to Israel, everything was completely different than what they were used to. In Ethiopia, people lived in a village. They were usually working on farms or other jobs. Everybody was independent. Everybody was self-sufficient. They didn't rely on the government. And they were all connected to the village and to the soil.
ולעומת זה, כשהגיעו ישר לישראל, אז עברו לגור בעיר, בדירות. כל אחד גר בעיר אחרת. לא יודעים את השפה. חלק מהילדים נשלחו למסגרות חוץ-ביתיות, אז ההורים וילדים נפרדו אחד מהשני.
When they came to Israel, they started living in cities rather than villages. They lived in apartments. People lived in various cities, in different cities. They were separated. They didn't know the language. Many children were sent out to live outside of the homes. They were separated from their parents.
ובעצם כל זה קרה, כל השינויים התרחשו באופן מיידי. ואנשים בעצם גרו בישראל, אבל הם גם היו עסוקים כל הזמן בלנסות להתאקלם בסביבה החדשה, וגם דאגו למשפחות שלהם שנשארו בסודאן ולמשפחות שלהם שנמצאים באתיופיה בתקופה לא פשוטה.
So everything, all those changes were immediate, and although people were physically living in Israel, but they were also concerned about their families, that part of the families remained in the Sudan and part of the families that remained in Ethiopia, and this was not a very easy period.
כל הדברים האלה השפיעו בעצם על המשפחה, על מערכת היחסים בין גבר לאישה, בין ילדים להורים. המעמד של הגבר השתנה בבית. ההורים הפכו להיות הרבה פעמים תלותיים בילדים שלהם מבחינת השפה וההתמצאות בארץ.
And the relationships in the family changed completely on their face. The relationship between men and women, between parents and children. The children became more knowledgeable than their parents. They were more able to find their way around in the new environment.
היה חשוב לי שאנשים יבינו, למשל אם יש בני זוג ובאתיופיה האישה בדרך כלל הייתה בבית או ממש רק בכפר, בארץ האישה גם יוצאת מהבית ובדרך כלל גם מרוויחה כמו הגבר, וזה יוצר המון מתח בתוך המשפחה. זאת דוגמה אחת.
For example, it was important for me that people understand the relationships between couples. In Ethiopia, for example, the woman usually stays at home and is dependent on the man for their livelihood. In Israel, both of them go out to work, and sometimes the woman makes more money than the man.
There's a beautiful story in this collection towards the end of the book, where you see the stresses that are put on a family, where the roles are suddenly reversed, where it's the woman who goes out, the narrator's mother who goes out to work, and the father is desperate to stay employed, to have a steady job. And you see the way that the system, the discrimination and the racism just slowly seems to bear down on this family, and in some ways to just grind them down. And it affects one of the characters. I don't want to give the story away, but it affects one of the characters in such a way that they can't bear it anymore. And I found that story exceptionally beautiful for the subtlety with which it handled that kind of societal pressure. I wanted to ask you also, I think this was something, many critics have mentioned that this book and you it opened a window into a community that has been very reserved and very private. It makes sense to me. Ethiopian culture, at least in Ethiopia and with my family and people I know, generally you don't necessarily talk about the things that bother you. If something happens, you keep it within. You remain kind of stoic. It feels almost like a national identity. And I was not surprised as I was, over the years, as I was following the news of the Ethiopian-Israeli community, that it's a closed place and most people don't know how to read that, and it's very hard to get to know this group of people. And yet here is your book, and it's published, and it gives people an opportunity to see what the lives of some families are like. And I was wondering, as I was reading this, was it difficult for you to decide to open this door so people could see in? Were there any considerations that you had to take or you had to make as you were writing about these families? Yes.
האם היה לך קשה, אני רוצה לשאול, אם היה לך קשה בגלל שלך היו אחד, ומה התחשב, על מה חשב, מה הייתה החשיבה שלך כאשר פתח את הדלת הזאת למשפחות הפרטיות, לכם
זה לא היה קשה לי, כי הגעתי בגיל 5 לישראל, ולא הרגשתי עם זה קושי.
It wasn't difficult for me. I came to Israel when I was 5 years old, so I didn't feel any difficulty doing this.
עכשיו באמת הקודים של האתיופים זה להיות עצור יותר, מאופק, וזה משהו שמכבדים באתיופיה. לעומת זה בישראל, אנשים מאוד פתוחים וחמים, לפעמים יותר מדי. זה יכול להתבטא בכך שאתה תלך ברחוב ומישהו ידבר איתך על הנושאים הכי אישיים שלו, בדרך כלל בקול רם, במקום ציבורי, וזה משהו נורא קיצוני.
It's true that in Ethiopia people hold back. They're not as open. On the other way, and in Israel, people are very open, and they don't see it as undignified to talk about the most private and personal issues with you in an open place, and they can ask you any questions, which is it's two extremes.
I wanted to start this out by reading for all of you, before Burhan reads and before I introduce him, just the end, the epitaph to this lovely book. And will you help me say this name? Mansur al-Hallaj. And Mansur al-Hallaj is a 9th century Persian mystic, I believe, and this is a quote from him that ends the book. Hell is not the place where we suffer, it's the place where no one hears us suffering, which is lovely and I think very, very fitting for this book. I wondered if you could explain a little bit about what this quote means to you and means to the book.
The story is about 4 people who are put in a small cell in a prison, 3 floors underground. It's a cell 1 meter by 2 meter. They are being tortured continuously. When they are left alone in the cell, then they need something to pass the time. Then they begin to tell stories to each other. All stories are about Istanbul, above ground. Because when you are underground, you have no sense of direction. You don't know west or east, south or north, just upwards. Because you feel that you are at the bottom of this earth. When you suffer underground, 3 floors underground, you are alone, you are in that pitch darkness. One thing you desire, or you just dream that, there is at least one person outside, above ground, knows that you are there, you are suffering. That's enough to keep you alive.
It's beautiful. Could you read for us your section, and I'm going to introduce you.
Ever since my childhood, my secret island had been Istanbul. On the winter night, when my father told me the story of the elderly cartographer, I took my map out of my school bag and drew an island on it. I dreamed happy dreams about it and loved it dearly. It was an era when I felt that people choose to see rather than understand. Everywhere the world was changing. People forgot how to love without seeing. They had no island to dream about. They didn't know what they were looking for. They couldn't comprehend how I could have loved this city for so many years from a distance. Having deleted the idea of conquest from their memory, they couldn't understand me. Every conquest clung to a dream and advanced along its own path. Jesus' path was different from Alexander the Great's. While Alexander conquered the city, Jesus wanted to conquer the people in the city. My dream was to conquer both the city and the people in it and save them both at the same time. Istanbul needed it. Everyone talked of Istanbul's beauty, but no one managed to live there happily. Uncertainty, selfishness, and violence masked the city's beauty. The members of a tribe beyond the seas slashed their children's faces and disfigured them so they wouldn't be abducted by the enemy and sold into slavery. That way, the children remained free. In their language, ugliness and freedom meant the same thing. Beauty and slavery were expressed with the same word. The Istanbul dwellers, too, lived in fear of losing their city and did everything in their power to destroy her beauty. Above and below ground, they were plunged in suffering, they clung to evil. They called disfiguring the city freedom. They couldn't see that evil's ultimate aim was to destroy beauty, but Istanbul could sense it. She made a stand against people's foolishness. That great city resisted all by herself, struggling to defend her beauty.
Thank you very much. Burhan was born in central Anatolia and grew up speaking Kurdish and Turkish, and later moved to Istanbul to study law. Due to political reasons, he lived in exile in Britain for some years, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I have a question about your time in the UK. And he received the Sedat Simavi Prize in 2011 for his second novel, which made him the youngest author ever to receive this prize. His novels are published in more than 20 countries, and his third novel, Istanbul, which we will be talking about today, it's in the US this month, or it will be. It's published.
Just this week. It's coming out.
This week. So please get it. It's absolutely beautiful. He has also done translation himself from English into Turkish, the poetry of William Blake. You just did that. That's wonderful. So it's my pleasure, really, to talk to you. We are also friends on Twitter, so we're really close. I have so many questions, but let me start out with this section that you just read, because there is a conversation here about beauty that I think also, Andrei, your book also participates in. You asked me, Andrei, about the ideological, what do you do when beauty is used as an ideology? And I immediately was thinking of your book, Burhan, and this sense of these. I think this is Uncle Kuheylan, who is talking about the construction of Istanbul, and in kind of this quest to make a city that's beautiful. It doesn't quite work out that way. Nobody is really happy in there. Could you talk a little bit more about this concept that Uncle Kuheylan has about Istanbul, but it's also something about beauty that you are tackling in this book?
Maybe it's a bit different from the situation it was described in the novel by Andrei Makine. Andrei pointed some great points. When it comes to my novel, nowadays in Istanbul, we are losing our city. The beauty and the history and the identity of the city is crumbling by the hand of politicians, construction firms, and other institutions. When it comes to Turkey, the beauty is not just a word in relation with aesthetic anymore. It's also a political word, because it's always destroyed, or it's always designed by politicians, by big powers, so you cannot keep yourself away from that contest. You know, you have to involve with politics, involve with the beauty of city in that context. So people, the characters in my book, when they are being tortured because of political reasons, they don't talk about political issues at all. They are always talking about the beauty of city, the stories about Istanbul, about how to save it from the hands of those evil people.
Very interesting. One of the things that one of the characters says, the prisoners are underground. They pass the time by telling stories to each other, by telling jokes, and they're really just waiting for the next interrogation session. And the doctor, there's one of the characters, the doctor, says to another character in the cell named Kamo, he says that he wouldn't want to know him outside of prison. That inside, though, they're in no position to judge each other. And he makes this really interesting comment. He says that in the jail, they are the purest form of human being. And I wondered if you could talk about that. I found that absolutely powerful. And it's still something that I'm trying to work through, even though, you know, I've read this book, but I wanted to ask you about that.
One of the main points of the book is talking about the pain. People who are in pain, they claim that the purest form of mankind, because they don't have any desire, any evil side, or any dream, apart from just getting away from that dream. So you can see them as transparent as, you know, a glass. So when they are being tortured and they are alone and they are helpless, they are free to tell everything to each other. They open their hearts, they treat their wounds, and they help each other when they come into the cell unconscious, or they cannot drink or eat anything. They needed each other. At that moment, they feel that they don't have anything bad, no evil with them. They are people or mankind in pain, the innocent form of our humanity.
That's very interesting, because even as these characters are telling each other their stories, I think it was the doctor, one of them said, well, no one is interested in your secrets. They could tell their stories, but they could not share each other's secrets. So there was still a part that they had to cover up, right?
That secret is something to protect some other people who are above ground, because they believe that they won't be able to get out of that cell alive. So they say, if we are going to die in the hand of interrogators, at least we should keep some other people outside this evil.
Time in underground, you mentioned earlier that there was no east or west. There really was a disorientation for the prisoners, and time warps for them there. They don't know how long, you know, whether it's night or day, or, you know, they get the same kind of bread, and they learn how to distinguish meals by whether one piece of bread they had earlier in the day was more rotten, more molded than the other. It's a different kind of system there of living and keeping time. And I thought here these were characters very much guided by their imagination, that they lived within this world that felt as real as the prison they were in, if not more real. And one of the things that I was reading in an interview with you was your biography, that you had been assaulted by Turkish forces, and it was almost a fatal assault, a very bad beating, and Burhan was in the hospital and had nothing to do in bed for months, right, except for watching television and writing notes, you mentioned. I couldn't help thinking of you healing and these prisoners in prison. As I was reading the stories, this idea of the place of the imagination when human beings are confronted with pain and being forced to endure it. And here you are in bed taking these notes, just writing, you said anything that you could imagine. And I started to wonder, how did you move from writing in bed just notes to understanding that this might be something you want to do because you studied law? How did that come about?
I think it would be very difficult for me to answer this question, let's say last year or 5 years ago. But now I can give an answer which is very satisfactory for myself. Lately I translated a poetry book by William Blake from English into Turkish. So I studied about William Blake, his ideas, his life, and his poetry last year. William Blake drew two lines. He says there is one comes from the religion, from the institution of the church, which is not good because it's corrupted. He's criticizing it very fiercely. On the other hand, he doesn't have any tendency towards enlightenment movement or new scientific improvements, because he was saying believe by heart or just getting the truth through the reason, through the brain is not enough. We need something else, which was imagination and dream. He was following that third path by his poetries. Now, after reading this, I realized, or I come to a conclusion that when I was writing those notes down and then decided to turn them into a novel, I think I was trusting only one thing. Maybe it was an instinct, as a human being. I was just dreaming, imagining, and then the reason follows it.
Very good, thank you. And we are close to running out of time. I have one more question, but while I am asking Burhan, can I have the other writers walk up here just for the sake of time? Burhan, I think one of the things I was also thinking about in relation to the epitaph, this quote that you had, it seems like with all the news happening right now, the news reports that we are getting of violence, of violent acts, of bombings, of attacks, of this huge global migration happening throughout Europe and Africa, it feels overwhelming to those of us that are, those of us getting this information. And you talk in your book about the way that telling our stories can offer us strength. But I wondered, can hearing or listening to painful stories help in any way? What happens when we're not the ones speaking these stories? What happens when the stories are coming to us? How should we be thinking of that?
By telling stories, I think we imagine that anything might happen to us. I'm not writing about myself. I'm not writing about what I've been through. I'm telling the stories of other people. I'm talking about the other people's pain. But by that, at the same time, I am talking about myself too, without mentioning it. I think that's a way sometimes we accept stories.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to open this up for a few audience questions from the audience. I will ask you, for the sake of time, please ask one question and make sure it's a question rather than a comment. Okay, there's one here. And speak loudly, and I'll repeat.
Right, I will ask my question in French. It's for Andrei. Voilà. Donc, est-ce que vous avez parlé du souvenir qui, quand vous avez donné l'exemple de la statue, et que l'homme voit et qu'il se souvient qu'il associe avec la femme, et ça m'a tout de suite évoqué à une passante de Baudelaire, qui est un poème où un homme croise une femme très belle, majestueuse, qui soulevait son ourlet dans la rue, assourdissante qui hurlait, et donc c'est un moment qui va rester toute sa vie. Et je voudrais donc savoir si la poésie peut-elle être le moyen justement de créer des instants d'éternité.
So when you mentioned this memory that's evoked by a statue in the subway where a man remembers a woman, I immediately thought of the Baudelaire poem À une passante, to a passer-by, which is a poem about a man being tremendously moved by the sight of a woman going by. And that led me to want to ask you, is poetry perhaps the means to create moments of eternity?
Oui, et je voudrais... Oui, et je voudrais paraître naïf ou idéaliste. Le monde dans lequel nous vivons nous apprend chaque jour que la place de la poésie se rétrécit tout le temps. C'est évident. C'est évident. Dostoïevski disait « La beauté sauvera le monde ». Comment peut-on interpréter ça? Comment peut-on interpréter ça? Vous avez évoqué Baudelaire. Baudelaire, ni Dostoïevski, ni Proust n'ont pas empêché les deux grandes guerres mondiales dans ce monde. Donc, la première impression, ben, la poésie est complètement inutile. On peut dire tout ce qu'on veut, l'histoire, les tortures, les totalitarismes continuent.
Yes, I want to seem naive or idealistic in my answer. It seems that it's very obvious that we look around now and we see everything showing us that the place that poetry has in the world is constantly getting smaller and smaller. That's obvious. Dostoevsky said, "Beauty will save the world." How do we interpret that? Baudelaire, whom you mentioned, Proust, Dostoevsky, none of them managed to prevent either of the world wars. So our first impression would be to say that poetry is not able to prevent the totalitarianism, the wars, all of these things that have happened.
Mais l'expérience totalitaire, l'expérience du goulag, prouve une chose. Les hommes qui connaissaient la poésie ont mieux survécu que les autres. Et je voudrais poser cette question à Burhan. Est-ce que sa connaissance de la poésie l'a aidé en prison?
But the experience of totalitarianism and the Gulag proved one thing, which is that the men who were in the Gulag who knew poetry survived it better than those who didn't. And so I wanted to ask Burhan this question: did his knowledge of poetry help him survive prison?
Yes. When first time I was detained in that kind of prison cell underground, I was the youngest in the cell. I was a student at the university studying law, because the others another 5 people with me in the small cell. They were treating me like their younger brother. They were trying to protect me. Someday I said, look, I'm young, but I write poetry. They said, oh, are you serious? I said, yes, I am serious. Then they asked me to read something by heart. And I read some lines. Some months or some years later, one of them came out when I returned back to school. He came back and he read the same poetry I read to him only once. He said, I never forget about it. So we have different bonds, you know, between each other, which is very much poetic.
Another question?
Yes, I'm curious, how is your book being received in Israel?
אני חושבת שבסך הכל בצורה טובה. אני חושבת שזה משהו שהיה חסר בספרות הישראלית. בדרך כלל אנשים אחרים שהם לא מהקהילה שלנו כותבים על הקהילה שלנו, אבל לא בספרות אלא במחקר יותר על הקהילה.
I think that all told it has been received well. I think this was something that was missing in the Israeli literature. Usually people who are not part of our community write about our community, but not as literature, but rather as research.
Do you feel completely integrated as a community, Ethiopian community in Israel, and are you happy there?
Do you feel
Do you feel completely integrated in the Israeli community, and do you feel happy?
And are you happy in Israel?
I'm happy. כן, כן. האמת שלא חשבתי על העניין הזה של החיים בישראל כהשתלבות, זה היה בשבילי משהו, הדבר היחיד שבעצם הכרתי, כי הגעתי בגיל מאוד צעיר, ורק כשהתחלתי להתבגר הבנתי שיש את העניין הזה שלפעמים אנשים, אני הרגשתי כישראלית תמיד, אבל הבנתי שבעצם אנשים לא רואים אותי ככה.
I grew up in Israel as a child, and I never felt this. I never thought about integration. Only when I grew up, I realized that I was perceived by other people as a different person, not part of the total Israeli society. But I myself never felt it as a person.
Another question? This is our last question.
I'm going to see if it becomes a question, because in Ethiopia, you were Ethiopian Jews, you were Jewish, and what motivated Ethiopian Jews to leave was to go to Israel and what that represents to, I'm just going to say, to a Jew. So, in the experience in Ethiopia, was there any form of prejudice, so to speak, because you were Jewish? I mean, is it like the racial prejudice in Israel weighs against the religious prejudice in Ethiopia? When your the sister in the story just wants to be thought of as a person? It's a funny question.
כן, באתיופיה, באזור שיהודים חיו, רוב היהודים גרו באזור שנקרא גונדר, וגם רוב האוכלוסייה הכללית באתיופיה היא נוצרית אדוקה. ייחסו ליהודים, קודם כל היו כל מיני קריאות גנאי, פלאשים, כל מיני כינויים, וגם היה יחס משפיל, לפעמים היו יכולים להאשים כל מיני עלילות או יחס מאוד לא טוב כלפי יהודים, ובעצם חיינו כמיעוט דתי שם.
Yes, oftentimes, when all the Jews lived in an area called Gondar. Most of the Jews lived in that area. Most of the Ethiopian population is religious Christian population, so in our area. So we were called names, we were called falashis, there were prejudices, there were plots made against us, we were humiliated, so yes, there was discrimination.
Thank you very much. Could we have a round of applause?